Hey there. I thought it might be useful to some more folk for me to document my journey with the Deity DLTX transmitters. So when I first saw the Deity Theos system, fell in love with it, thought it would be really good for someone amateurish like me who's wanting to start a YouTube channel about Lego. You would never guess in the background, eh? But then I found out that it didn't have an analog limiter, so what I wanted it to do was I wanted the body packs to have lavs for when I'm walking around my hopeful Lego city, and I also wanted to use desk mics like this Shure SM57 and Shure SM58 for when I was talking to the camera at my desk. So the DBTXs didn't seem... I found out that without an analog limiter, you were able to clip it. So I wanted something a bit simpler for my amateurish nature while I learned to gain stage. So when the DLTX came out and it was found out it would have phantom power, be able to power desktop mics as well as having analog limiter, I thought that was ideal for me. So I bought two of them, and I bought the incredibly expensive L3-Link cables for what's not really much cable for that kind of money, but I presume it's the Lemo connector that costs all the cash. And when I plugged it, the L3-Link cable, so Lemo to XLR, straight into the Shure SM58 and SM57. SM57's got a big windsock on it. Supposedly makes it sound more like an SM7B, but I'm not quite sure about that, but that's what it is. I found that when I set it to 5 volts, because they're dynamic mics, they don't need phantom power, that I didn't get a signal, no signal at all. And I've now subsequently found out from page 13 of the Deity manual that that's because the pinout changes on the DLTX depending on what you set it to. So if you set it to 5 volts or line, then the hot signal is pin 3. And if you set it to mic 48 volts, the actual pin 1 becomes the hot signal instead of the shield. So yeah, that's why when you set it to 5 volts. So as the Shure mics are pretty robust, I set them to 48 volts, and I found that I was getting an awful lot of noise, like so much noise. As you can see, I previously had a Zoom F3, and it was incredibly good preamps, and the signal was awesome. But with the Shures, I was getting an awful lot of noise. It was almost unusable. So I've tried various different things. So with me not getting a signal, I tried 48 volts. That had a lot of noise. So what I have done subsequently is I have plugged in the Rode VLXLR Pro, and that takes phantom volt and turns it down into 5 volts. I then bought a cheap 3.5mm to XLR converter. Unfortunately, that converter, the pinout was slightly wrong, so it only worked when it was slightly out. It wasn't properly seated in the connector, and that was because this is the pinout for the cable I bought. So the hot was the hot was on the tip, the cold was in the collar, and then the ground was the sheath. So for it to work properly in the VXLR Pro, apparently the hot needs to be that little collar bit, and the cold needs to be the tip. So I unscrewed the XLR cable, soldered it, and then hot glued it because my soldering is atrocious and I didn't want it coming away. And that seems to work. But again, it seems to have less noise than the 48 volts, but not greatly. The DTs can only go up to 42 decibel gain. The other thing I've tried doing is this ghetto here. So I tried to find anything that would fit in the Lemo connector. And, you know, a twisted core of a Cat5 cable, some pins. I've tried everything I could find, and what I eventually found fitted in there were the legs of resistors. So what I did was I trimmed the legs of these resistors off, and I soldered them, again badly, hence the hot glue gun. The hot glue gun's also there to operate as insulation so that the hot signal, the cold signal, and the shield don't all intersect. So I placed them, I soldered them into the pins, and then placed the pins in the connector and hot glued it all in place. Obviously not hot glue on the Lemo itself. Again, even despite its ghetto-ness, that seems to have much less self-noise. I'm going to put audio samples up at the end showing, you know, different levels of gain. So apparently the lowest signal to noise ratio on the DLTX is 30 decibels. So I'll set it at that. I'll try 42, which is the max, gets a nice decent signal. So I'll turn them on now. So this one here is set to 5 volts. And this one here is set to 48 volts, which is then stepped down to 5 volts by the VXLR Pro. So the idea is that I want to use a Rode Lavalier 2, that's the front facing one, and also the Deity W.Lav Pro, it's already got a Lemo connector. So with the 3.5mm lav, I'll use the VXLR Pro clip to my belt and then place it into that to power the 3.5mm lav. Also means I can use that lav on my phone. I have bought an actual Lemo connector, as you can see, but my soldering, as we've already covered, is incredibly bad. So eventually, had this worked as a ghetto mechanism here, I would have soldered it onto a proper Lemo connector. But as you'll see from the audio samples, there's still an awful lot of noise and I don't consider it usable. So I'm probably going to use this Lemo connector to change this 3.5mm perhaps over to a Lemo, or as I say, keep the flexibility for my phone and just use it on an L3-Link all the time. So we can see here that, as you can see as I'm talking into the SM57, that I'm getting a bar, and you can see that it's going green. But we'll find in the samples that the audio is just not good enough. Same with the 58. As I'm talking into the 58, despite it getting ghetto, you'll find that the levels are going green, despite its ghetto-ness. But again, despite the green on the transmitter, it's just not a usable signal. Okay, so that's where I've got to. Spoke to someone on Reddit, and they'd used the DXTX, because that's what I'd been considering originally. I was going to get the DXTX, so I wouldn't need all these adapter cables, and I was just going to 3D print a bracket to hold it on my belt, hold two of them, because I was a Boy Scout and I want to be prepared, so I wanted to use both lavs at the same time in an Ursa chest strap, so that if one gets too much clothing rustle, I can just rely on the other one. They tried a DXTX and they found very similar results, which I would expect, because the DXTX spec sheet also says it does 42 decibels of gain, so I couldn't see how a transmitter with a slightly different connector giving similar battery life was going to somehow magically make it work with the Shure microphones any better. The DLTX doesn't mention working with dynamic mics, which it clearly doesn't without a lot of fiddling. So obviously this one's got the L3-Link into the VXLR Pro into the 3.5mm, and this one's just a sort of home botched Lemo connector, but with the pin out the correct way. I did have, which I meant to get for years beforehand, it's a very short XLR kind of adapter bar, and I'd rewired it, but it doesn't seem to be working. I really can't explain why right now. It should work in my opinion, but either my soldering's just not good enough, or I've done something else wrong. I can find it now, but it's basically the size of two XLR connectors wide, and it's connected by a tube. Why can I not find that? My desk is so neat and tidy as well. I actually found it Shure themselves, I think it is, do one. I'll put the model number in the post. But yeah, it's basically like two XLR. It's a solid piece like this, and it's got a male on one end and a female on the other end. So I rewired that. I changed the pin out what I thought it should work. So I thought I could just plug that onto the end of the L3-Link and thought that would be a solution. But for some reason, I've either wired it up wrong, my soldering's wrong, or I've done something wrong, but it certainly isn't getting a signal. No, honestly, I have no idea what I've managed to do with that. No, can't find it. I'll put a picture up if I can. Okay, so that's my journey. I'll put the audio samples up. You can let me know what you think of my ghetto connector. So again, I need to be very careful when I'm zooming in to make sure that none of these pins are bridged, because obviously the weight of this connector. I did think about perhaps gluing this over the top of it, try and keep it stable and steady, but I'm literally just going to do it for the samples, and then this will never be used again, because these mics aren't going to work. My next plan is I have a place that's got a couple of mics, a couple of condenser mics. I don't have any here. and I'm going to borrow them and try sample each of them, get some samples for those. So I'm going to get a SE X1, have to leave a deliberate pause there, and I'm going to get a AKG C1000S. So I'll try each of those. I have found for the sensitivity, I've been trying to sort of look at mics with higher sensitivity so they don't need as much gain. So I'm probably going to end up myself purchasing a Rode NT1 Signature Series or in Gen 5. They seem to have 75 milliwatts, which seems quite high. I had ideally wanted to use a Shure SM86 because I've got the Shure shock mount collars. I've got a lot of windsocks that fit the SM58 that would have fitted the 86, but I'm just going to bite the bullet, I think, and get a Rode NT1. And there was another microphone, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, it's got a really high milliwatt that I figured wouldn't need much gain. So I've been sort of previewing that to see which ones are likely to work with this setup. Thanks for your time.